Okay, now we're entering part two on this. We're right at a magical moment where he's been given all of these gifts by Ea, Enki, and all the other gods gave him a part of certain things that, were sacred to them. And so they put it all together and he becomes the master over all here. And he calls up some winds, and that becomes real important with the four winds. It's in a lot of people's other stories. And of course, where does the wind come from? And all these things are attributed to gods. But in this story, he calls up these winds and thunderbolts and he registers for battle. And this, of course, has to do with Zeus and things like that and stuff that comes out of these stories just directly after that make connections. But in this idea, Marduk provokes Tiamat with insults, and he does that for a reason, kind of tricks her into a hasty attack, leaving herself kind of vulnerable. And so she's captured by a magic net. And then before Marduk's arrow ends up taking and piercing her open from her side. Now, there's one story that shows you this idea, and it's because there's an ancient tale where you see that recurved bow over there to the left, and it's even echoed in your Bible in a strange, different way. But the great Nimrod was killed off by a guy called Hike. I mean, you can look this up and it'll show you this, and where he's standing there with a recurved bow trying to do something in an Orion pose, which shows you another connection that I made 3.5 years ago on this. But here's this connection here, and it ends up destroying her side and explodes. And of course, that's why there's little holes all in her, because she kind of blows up. In the other tale, she actually opens her mouth like a dragon, ready to breathe forth her fire. And right whenever she does, he blows all these winds into her, and it blows her up like a balloon. And then while she's blown up like a balloon, he shoots the magic arrow into her, and it blows up her insides. So you can see a few variations on a theme. In fact, the weird thing we're looking at is something that's variation on a theme that's already come from before, and these ancient tales that go back to before very first writing. And then in their tales, they tell you this tale comes from long ago, long, long ago. Some of them even describe these tales coming to before they even made bread or anything like that, before any of this happened. That kind of idea. Like an old man standing out in the yard, I remember none of this was here. But on a real level here, people. Okay? So there are things about this that show connections, though. And of course, so he ends up crushing her skull with a mace and then splitting her arteries open. And by the way, the reason that we're here on Earth is supposedly from this giant body of this gigantic dragon that he killed. But what's crazy is there she is still in the stars. But we're created from her. So one of them is that story about how the cosmos created and as above, so below, and this is how we get created. And in that tale, Marduk ends up using half of her dead body to form the heavens and the little skull that goes up over it here. And we'll get into that with what's used in her body. But this idea that this primordial dragon got killed and created the earth, and we're actually on her, and that Tiamat's veins run with gold, and Bahamut's run with silver. In fact, when you get to Dungeons and Dragons, which I'll probably show you in part 3 on this concept coming up in your top left-hand corner, but a ways down from now, we'll explain and show you the fact of that and the way that they still kept that with mythology whenever they talk about them in Dungeons and Dragons and things like that. And then, yeah, there's this Hydra Tiamat thing that goes on, and she's Queen of the Dragons and everything from this mythology that Proto-Indo-Europeans started long, long ago, and no, not the time you're thinking about, but well before that, and pushed down through these areas that show that's the way that archaeology shows that the way humans migrated and stuff before anything ever happened. And now genetics have turned around and reconfirmed it a few dozen times. I'll refer to those in other parts and other videos. I'm not going to go all the way there yet, but I'm going to show you something about written in the stars on this one here, hopefully before it ends on this. But so he crafts so from her eyes are created the two rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, and from her breasts are made the great mountains. And they're in heaven too. There's Geminites, the twins, but it was mountains in Sumerians. I'll kind of flash that here later too, along with another thing that shows a revealing thing about written in the stars, even though I've shown it a few times before. Or you can look those up. So what's left of her becomes the oceans. But Enki's master of the Absu. So this shows you the original story that was there, and then that's Neptune. Yeah, so when I talk about being just, the Neptune's lagoon being the Mediterranean necessarily, it's, no, I wouldn't really. That's actually the whole ocean of the whole world, and oh, funny how that connects. So just like my onion, everything goes much deeper, but remember how she created 11 monsters? Well, that's 12 versus her, because she's in the sky too, and she did that again to avenge the number of pop-up people and older Mesopotamian lore. And so this was a reinventing of itself and telling you that the old people were those men of well-renown, giants of old, or a Titan type of thing that we see in the stories of the Greeks. There are others that have the same idea. In fact, we've talked about it being in Egypt and the way they went off their idea, and more animalistic and so on. But this is just variations on a theme. And here we have a guy throwing the thunderbolts of Ninurta, an ancient Sumerian war god, and doing the so and killing off Ansu bird, which was the same telling of before in this idea. And hey, it's got a flying dragon in it, and that has attributes of other creatures thrown into one as a conglomerate. And there it is. It's got a bat face on it and all these things of the underworld. And these Sumerian texts date from much earlier than that, and they show that there's a list of monsters and they're attributed to Tiamat. And how many were there? Well, there's 11. And then there are also monstrous deities associated with it. And there's also in the Greek tales, like in the Argo, and where it looks, and the back half of it gets knocked off and so on. That's because that's the way that it looks in the stars. In fact, you can still see that today. I'll show you a picture of that here shortly. I just want to load up a few things onto here. But this ancient sea, Absu of space, creature that lives there, is the same one that lives here and the same one that lives there. So it's actually the Canaanite god Yam. It's Leviathan. So even a variation of this has been found where Baal kills the god of Yam. That's Canaanites. Leviathan, all these different ones that are really the same thing, but Tiamat herself appears by name in an invocation back in the time of ideograms and earliest Sumerian writings. By name. And she's a patron of a furious warrior in a text that's there, showing you that actually at one time there were people behind this idea and not another, and that gives you the idea of snake worship and all this stuff and things that people left behind. But some of it probably, like they tell you in Lord of the Rings, some of these things should not have been forgotten. Because we're sitting here in almost a state of amnesia, and when we look back at these weird things and start to put it all together, a lot's been shown, but they want to steer away from the real points. And that's why in my videos I try to make points of like who was who, what was where, what was going on, how did they get this story, how did they get that, hey, this is where that comes from, this is all it's known, but it even shows it goes back way far that. This idea of astrotheology. But it's not only about that, because the story is built on something that has to do with ancestor veneration. But in these stories of the oldest parts of it, there's an idea that her power is to be feared and admired and so on too. And this dragon, it's attached more to people than it's attached to anything. And then we've shown the idea of, well, what does he want? Well, at first he wants some gold, and he wants some cattle and stuff, and then pretty soon he wants your women, or virgins actually, and so on. But here we see one of those rolled out tablets here that's on the seals, and the same type of ideas going on. And Well, she's not that big anymore. Well, could you put her on a seal if she was? If you did, then how big would he be in reaction to it? Because it gets to the point where she's bigger than Godzilla and bigger than any dinosaur that's ever created, because you've got to realize that she's the big giant Milky Way in the sky. And whenever it shows her in a little pose here, a pose there, if you just took that pose of Hydra and threw it on the earth, that's way bigger than anything that's like, you know, any monster that we can end up gumming with, much less Godzilla, let's just say. This would probably be a good point to go here and show you one thing before we go to another. So here we're looking at a portion that you could pretty much cover with your hand stuck out at distance here in front of your face in the night sky. But each one of these are constellations. In fact, there's actually more than here, the ones that are little fit-ins and so on. But these are the main ones in conjunction here in this idea, and it has a lot to do with the coming of the seasons and the fact that here's a river and everything. So hopefully you can see it says Celestial Absu here where the river's coming around. That's symbolically the Tigris and Euphrates of all these people that came up with this stuff and ancient folklore and so on that led to the writing things that you know about and so on. But in the bottom left-hand corner, there's that Argo boat. And in Sumerian, it actually has a connection that ends up meaning the same thing as ark, and how the ark was upon the waters and the floods of the thing and this, that, and the other, and how it hooks up. But then there's also Dumuzi, who is being looked at as Orion. So there's that connection. But what's missing is over here is Aries, which at this time is a plowman, or is a plow attached to a man. Here it is right here. But that's also Aries. And then that's Jesus, who becomes the Lamb. And then, you know why they were so sure of the fact that Jesus was one with the Father and everything, is the fact that this all comes and hooks up to this God that's right here, that's sitting on the right-hand side over here, and he's the water god. Well, what is he? He's Aquarius. He's Neptune, he's Enki in the Absu, but he's also in the place of where the God of the Bible is in those stories that hook up to it. And here he is hooked up to Capricorn and the Tropic of Capricorn, and how those all worked out with zodiacal symbols and this idea. And you can see there's fish and dolphins here in the southern fish. So this is the sea of the stars, and why some people came up with a story that the ocean was, the space was full of water, and if God let up some vents, that caused the flood of the earth, which we knew now that's not at all what they were telling you. But these people were telling you something that was a little more esoteric, but a little more truth to the science that we have today, by the way. There's that sea serpent I'm right on top of right there. And so here's that story that's there, that's still in the stars that you can see. In fact, Orion being right there and showing you this, that's Jesus walking on water. Here's the guys in the boat. But it's also the story of the Argo and the Iliad and the Odyssey and things that go along there. Here's the twin mountains of Gemini. And Jesus has a twin. Oh, they're certain of it. And there's mythologies go. And of course, this hooks up to the 12 labors of Hercules going around the Zodiac and everything else. So it's quite revealing once you get into this idea of written in the stars and the astrotheology that goes along with what made this all up. So, woo, there's all these demons that come out of that, and that becomes out of the imagination of men. And a lot of my videos that I show, especially through holidays and so on, or Halloween, I show about, oh, here's how they came up with werewolves and how it has a connection to do with silver and silver's atomic weight and all these things that can make connections in the moon. And it's 108 sacred number that goes along with it. And that's why that's the bane of the wolf and all this stuff. And he howls at the moon and it all goes together. Can't you see? Oh, we can do that about Frankenstein too, and this idea of golems and creating that. In fact, man was created from mud, if you want to believe in this story. So there's a lot of connections that go along with that. But before the idea of even demons being on the earth, or if somebody was, had some affliction, they've got some demon in them or anything else, now we'd call germs and so on. There was thought that these creatures inhabited people. And you don't think it goes on, but there are still exorcisms that have happened in a modern day. But so a lot of these visual traits that we go of with these creatures and then what happens and the Sumerian mythology that goes along with this gets grafted onto Tiamat. And even though she's a Virgo type person and the mother eventually of all, and of course Inanna, which becomes Virgo the Virgin, and Venus too, and a lot of other people that are shown around, each one gets their turn at being, in the Zodiac and in stories here that can be woven out of just using puns, as I've showed in the Written in the Stars series, and these ancient puns, using that Zodiac we just looked at earlier, in different words, just like we would use a thesaurus today, and other forms where it sounds like this word or that word, and so on, and being able to use that in a way of grafted a lot of these stories that we even have to this day, and a lot of mythologies too, and the other half of it, and the pagan idea. And so it was looked at that the Marduk was actually just a local god at one time and stuff, but they ended up taking and putting him on a pedestal and making this idea. And there's a reflection of that concept and how he fell down or whatever, great Babylon the Great and so on. And also an idea that a star falling from heaven can be Lucifer and the connections that goes to and so on. But this was all about the time of the rise of Hammurabi and all these different laws that got written that you'll find is real important in the tales of Moses and all these things that come out of it saying, well, it didn't happen like that, it happened like this. And they try to give ideas. The problem is archaeology shows, well, you're so strangely, from this point on, and I'm telling you before too, in an esoteric way, but prominent from that point on in these people, you were said to have been a product of a dragon. And if you've looked into ancient Chinese beliefs and these people that were up here in the Tarim Basin and so on, they had these ideas too about dragons and being born from them and then being down from a major god that you would end up calling a dragon or so on in these ancient tales. But that's where the Chinese get that concept too, and dragons and so on. And I don't want to get into the whole who had who first or whatever, or did whatever out of the things where we look at gunpowder or rice or anything else. So it's probably not fair, and let's not do that. But all these stories were meant to mention, good and evil in fitting metaphors, and a lot of times it was used for their right to rule and connections to the myth of Tiamat and Marduk's great battle, and all of these ideas led that down to them. Just like before then, they were claiming the pantheon that was there before in Enlil and so on, and then before that we would end up going with Enki. And before that, it just starts to drift off into a time that their beliefs would be something that if we studied it, we would be like, oh, this is like the elves, which I've made a lot of talk about before too, and that's connection to a people that lived before cities and agriculture. It ended up coming to this. In fact, there's a story about an Akitu festival. This has to do with this acre and plot of land that actually gets rewritten into the story in the stars that I showed earlier as the ark, and where it comes to land, and there it is up the Euphrates. It's about here, it's in the Caucasus Mountains and so on. Why? Because that fit with their idea of what they had already figured out where all this comes from in the first place, up there in the Black Sea region. In fact, that Black Sea got flooded in at one time and caused a hellacious problem. So a lot of this mythology comes from all that, and you don't think that they didn't have dragons too much. See this famous gate here everybody looks at and everything? A lot of times they don't look up close. Those things with the longer necks on them, they look kind of like giraffes. Those are dragons with a forked tongue and everything. But then a lot of the other creatures that look like cows kind of actually only have one horn because they're showing them in straight profile. So there's a unicorn type looking thing, and then there's lions too. What has this got to do with it? Well, if you get up on the tower tops right there at nighttime, there's no extra light around, you can look around and do astronomical studies and stuff and use math and figure out all kinds of things. It is literally amazing whenever you start to get back into this and you look at what they knew and what is attributed to the Sumerians coming up with, which now we know wasn't just popping like popcorn, but had come from a conglomerate before. And the only reason we tried to popcorn ancient Sumeria is because of trying to go along with a biblical idea that was shattered long, long ago with other archaeological finds. You don't think so? How about Göbekli Tepe, Catalhoyuk, and all these other places that show you their connections? In fact, deciphering their astronomical beliefs and so on actually shows you something that blends into something that blends into something. It works pretty darn good, actually. So let's see if we can get a little bit farther before we go to part 3 here on it, which will be in your top left-hand corner. But this was a Akitu festival, and it was really a first of the year type festival. The Akitu festival was. But really, you know, we never knew anything about this until the 1900s came along, and all of a sudden, Woolley and all these guys ended up finding, hey, here's the stories that go along and everything, and everybody was pretty amazed, and they got some people to decipher tablets, and lo and behold, they came up with the flood story and this other story that seems like it's got a twist on this and this, that, and the other, and of course it predates everybody. And really our modern construction and the idea of Tiamat comes from that. But if you've looked, we've never really let go of the dragon idea. It's still in a lot of our mythologies to this day. There's still movies that are out there. One of the most popular movies of our time, of course, was Lord of the Rings, and there's one definitely in that. In fact, it's one of the major things. In fact, in the real folklore concept that comes from, that idea of what's in that mountain that created everything, was a dragon that's got enough heat to create a forge that could end up forging these ideas. Well, no, we know that people, when they started doing this, there was a certain people that had it and others didn't, and there was a story behind it, and the breath of a dragon and so on. And you look at some of these stories and you're like, you're talking about a forge and how you pump the forge and everything. That's you're kind of got it secretly woven into that idea. That's okay, cool. But this great red dragon of Revelations is there. In fact, it says it whenever you look at the Sumerian puns on words and stuff. It's there. It's the red dragon. It's the big one, and it's the dragon of Revelations. Well, it's got all these heads and so on too. Yeah, that's Hydra from the other story, and there's Tiamat, the depiction we have of her today, because she is like Marduk, and she has all of the powers of the other ones. And so each head does a different thing, where one of them casts lightning, the other one casts an acid type poison, the other one is a winter dragon that creates this and creates that. Well, what is that? Well, there used to be a winter dragon, and there used to be a dragon of summer. There used to be one for 4 seasons and so on like that too, in a lot of these stories too. And that's what the beating of their wings. You hear the story that when a butterfly bats his wings in Argentina, it makes a storm happen in France or something like that. Well, in these ancient beliefs, they talked about the winds having happened from that, and that there were spirits that were blowing things around. Now we know that that's cold and hot and high level and low level, pushing on each other and so on, in open areas. But back then it had a little bit of a science theology going on with this idea. And so a lot of these stories that come off of that, and you know, Tiamat is a female dragon. She's a queen of a hideous host who are hostile to the gods. And this is an idea that came about much later, looking at these later interpretations of it. Whenever you look at the earliest ones, like I talked about her coming into the procession of a queen and getting to meet the king on, and all the ones as she goes around, that's through the planets in order. And then she accidentally bumps into Earth, spilling her drink upon her, and then a fight ensues, and then her bodyguard Kingu gets his head lopped off, and he ends up turning pale as he's facing her, and it says he's forever facing her. And you're like, no, you can walk away eventually. Oh wait, that's the man in the moon. Kingu is the moon. Hold on, okay, so this whole story is how we got the moon and everything, and you find in the modern day, that's the idea we've got going on when the Earth was formed so long ago. Like 4.32 billion years ago. Like, oh wait, that's a number, that's a sacred geometry too. How is this all working out? These people knew all this stuff before. Well, it's the pagans that had it all figured out. It's other people who twisted it into what we have beliefs on even to this day, but science just trumped a lot of that, let's just say. And then it's like the hideousness, and then of course we've got to go put that with a dragon, because nobody's more scared of being in the water and having something that's a monster get you in some way or another. And a dragon would be the worst thing of all, worse than even a crocodile, which is what their face is kind of built around, but a lot of dinosaurs are. But in this idea, they've taken her to end up being the negative view, of course, and the way things have been twisted in its current state. You got, in Babylon, the horde, all that and everything. So we've got to go against that concept, or we're told to. But in that idea, she's been taken to be a personification of chaos and things like that. And then hold on, that's the story that everybody has too, is that there was chaos and tohu and bohu and Tiamat and Bahamut, and there it is again, right back in front of you. It's amazing how this just all keeps enveloping on itself. And why can't it change more than a certain amount? The thing is, there's only a certain amount of depictions or constellations to hook up to each other, and puns that you can put on each other. Anything past that point would be made off of something that they made off of puns that was off of it. And now we can get a thick thing in here. But here's Tiamat from my game that I play, but any Dungeons and Dragons and all folklore and everything like that, where she's got the different heads and each one has the different ideas and stories in it in one deal. And she's not even a mother there, but she's the offspring of the great dragon creator god known as Io. That sound familiar to anybody? But as this incredible five-headed dragon, she's known to be in constant battle with her brother, as an instance, as Bahamut. And so you have these type of ideas, and this is not the game that I play. This is a different one showing you it, but then there you're fighting Tiamat and Bahamut, and it's always one of the major things, one of the major campaigns. You have to fight all these different dragons and so on. That pisses her off. You find out where she is, you go after her. A lot of times it's not solo like the shown here, but you have to get groups together and everybody has to pull their weight and do certain things or it's not going to work out. Makes a cohesive unit. It's kind of cool when you play in the game too. Some of these are so difficult, you got to get everybody on a mic and they're calling out certain things at certain times because she's fixing to do this. Oh, here comes this edge. You've got to do that when this head happens. And then whenever this head happens, the other guy over here's got to do this, and makes it all work out kind of strange. But so they're taking away and fighting away the chaos. And if you'll look at the ancient story, it wasn't chaos, it was the way that it showed everything came out of chaos. But the way that it involved all these monsters, and then now we're master of beasts and all this thing that comes over, and we've took over and named all the monsters and did the thing like Adam or whatever, we look at it in a different way. And then so in some ways we have to go against, concepts, ideas. But, is there some way to look back at things that happened before this, or tales that people had? Well, tales of like the Minotaur is one of them. It's just kind of like the tales of Bigfoot and things that would happen out of that. And if you look at the Inky story with Enkidu and how that happens, it's kind of that idea also showing you they knew kind of that we came out of wild men to civilization and all this happened, and they weave it into this weird mythology that probably most people would agree with a whole lot more than this idea that a woman grew from a rib and ate from a magic tree because a talking snake told her to. Well, later that snake gets his legs removed and he has to walk along on his belly. So he was a wise, talking, walking snake. That's kind of a serpent thing, and there's a dragon there. I made a 6-part series that shows that a lot of these connotations they give for God shows that it's hooked up to an idea that we would accredit to a dragon. Whether or not you could say, oh, all of them are, no, you put it together as a concept, it really looks like it. All these other people had concepts like that too at the time, and all this stuff. We have folklore today, and what's the scorpion dude, what's this, that, and the other, and monstrous heads, Hydra, and all this stuff. Well, a lot of it comes from this mother of all dragons that happened at one time here, this Tiamat, and her godly offspring that she did. And of course, some of them ended up being taken into ancestor veneration and they got put into a place that's the underworld concept. But other ones are put up and they're in the overworld. Now this is really just basically during this time of the year what is shown above the landscape, and then what's secretly down below that you can't see right now, but you'll see it the other part of the year as it spins around in its 12-month zodiacal wheel. But the idea that you go to hell or you go this, that, and the other, it really wasn't in their concepts. They've got a lot of different ones of them. But this idea is that, well, you end up going to dwell with these certain people after life, and just because there's an afterlife that's in the underworld or the other side of the world in a special place, like what would be America now to the ancient people of the others, or to take some idea and to say, well, instead of being in the one below, you want to be the one up in heaven. You want to be up in the spring, summer one. You don't want to be in the one that's in the fall and winter type time. That looks like that's bad. And of course, us as humans separating things from good and bad and all those type of situations have ended up leaving you with the idea of yin and yang and all this type of stuff, and you want to pin bad on this one, and then, oh, when we do, next thing you know, they're Hitler and they're Nazis and they're everything else, they're the worst thing in the world, because you want to tag them with it. And that's kind of what happened here whenever it was looked at as in ancient times the mother of all dragons and the mother of all creation. Mother Earth herself was created out of a dragon. Isn't that interesting? Let me know what you think down below. And yeah, I was able to cram it into 2 because I don't want to go in this extra story in this one extra part here. If I do, I'm going to be off in the left field for a while, and it's really a left field kind of thought. And I've got another video that is already in once, and I'm going to put it in another one that's coming up. So stay in touch. Let me know what you think down below. Like that video. Peace.